My parents threw me away at 7 in a park after my baby brother was born, and they decided 3 kids were too expensive. So my adoptive family, the Delgados, raised me, loved me, and when they both passed in a car accident, I inherited their family restaurant chain worth $4, $2 million. My biological parents, who I hadn't seen in 22 years, suddenly found my address and filed a lawsuit claiming they never legally relinquished parental rights and deserved compensation for their emotional suffering. The courtroom fell silent when the judge read their demand for $2,100,000, exactly half of everything I owned, everything the Delgados had built. My biological mother dabbed theatrically at dry eyes while my biological father adjusted his cheap suit, both performing their practiced roles of grieving parents reunited with their lost daughter. I sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, watching them, my face expressionless. My lawyer leaned toward me, whispering urgently that we needed to prepare a defense strategy, but I simply reached into my briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope, placing it deliberately on the table between us. The judge noticed the movement, his eyes narrowing with interest. What my biological parents didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew except me, was that I had spent the last 3 months since receiving their lawsuit doing something they clearly never bothered to do: actual research. The Delgados had taught me many things during the 22 years they raised me, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was their meticulous approach to documentation. Every receipt saved, every contract filed, every photograph dated and labeled. When I inherited their restaurant empire, I also inherited their obsessive organizational system, including a locked filing cabinet in their home office that I'd finally opened 2 weeks ago. Inside, I found adoption papers, legal documents, and most importantly, a private investigator's report from 1995, the year they adopted me. Apparently, Carlos and Rosa Delgado had wanted to understand exactly what kind of people would abandon a 7-year-old child in a public park, and they'd paid someone to find out. What that investigator discovered would have been useful information for my biological parents to consider before filing their frivolous lawsuit. The judge cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to the present moment. My biological mother was now testifying, her voice quivering with manufactured emotion as she described the unbearable pain of losing touch with me. She spoke of sleepless nights and endless tears, painting a picture of maternal devotion that would have been touching if it bore any resemblance to reality. My biological father nodded along supportively, adding his own embellishments about how they'd searched everywhere for me, how they'd never stopped hoping to reunite with their precious daughter. The performance was almost impressive in its audacity. Their lawyer, a slick-looking man with styled hair and an expensive watch, presented their case with practiced sympathy. He spoke about parental rights, about family bonds that transcend time and circumstance, about the deep psychological trauma my biological parents had suffered from our forced separation. He made it sound as though they'd been victims of some terrible injustice rather than people who'd made a calculated decision to reduce their household expenses by abandoning one of their children. I remembered that day in the park with crystalline clarity, though I'd spent years trying to forget it. My mother had packed my favorite stuffed rabbit in a small backpack along with a change of clothes and a peanut butter sandwich. My father had driven us to Riverside Park, the big one with the playground and the duck pond, and told me we were going to play a special game. Hide and seek, he'd called it. I was supposed to count to 100 by the big oak tree while they hid, and then I should look for them. If I couldn't find them, I should wait by the tree and they'd come back eventually. I'd counted carefully, excited about the game, my voice carrying across the empty morning park. When I'd finished counting and opened my eyes, their car was already gone from the parking lot. I'd waited by that tree until it got dark, until a park ranger found me shivering and crying, clutching my stuffed rabbit and my now empty backpack. The sandwich had been eaten hours earlier, and I'd been too scared to move from my designated waiting spot. The Delgados had fostered me initially through the state system, and when my biological parents never came forward to claim me despite widespread media coverage of the abandoned child, Carlos and Rosa had begun adoption proceedings. They'd owned 3 restaurants then, small family-style places that served authentic Mexican cuisine in different neighborhoods across the city. They'd treated me like I'd always been theirs, never making me feel like a burden or an obligation. Rosa had taught me to make tamales from scratch, while Carlos had shown me how to balance the restaurant books. They'd paid for my education, celebrated my achievements, and loved me unconditionally for 22 years until a drunk driver ran a red light and took them both from me in an instant. The grief had been devastating, made worse by the discovery that they'd named me sole heir to everything they'd built together. The restaurant chain had grown significantly over the years. What had started as 3 modest establishments had expanded into 7 high-end locations, each one carefully designed to honor traditional Mexican culture while appealing to modern sensibilities. The business was worth $4,200,000, according to the most recent appraisal, and my biological parents apparently wanted exactly half of that amount. Their lawyer was now presenting financial hardship documents, claiming my biological parents had suffered economic difficulties over the years that were directly related to the trauma of losing me. He showed the judge credit card statements and medical bills, painting a picture of struggling working-class people who deserved compensation for their pain. What he conveniently failed to mention was that every single one of those financial problems was self-inflicted and easily traceable to their own poor decisions. My lawyer finally stood to begin our defense, but I touched his arm gently, stopping him. The judge looked at me with raised eyebrows as I rose to my feet instead, the manila envelope now in my hands. My biological parents exchanged confused glances, their lawyer frowning with concern. This wasn't how court proceedings typically worked, a defendant representing themselves mid-trial, but the judge seemed intrigued enough to allow it. I approached the bench with measured steps, my heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor. Every eye in the room followed my movement. When I reached the appropriate distance, I held up the envelope so the judge could see it clearly. Inside this envelope, I said, my voice steady and clear, are documents that paint a very different picture of my biological parents' character and their true motivations for this lawsuit. I'd like to submit them as evidence for the court's consideration. The judge gestured for me to approach, and I handed him the envelope. As he began to extract the contents, I turned to face my biological parents directly for the first time since entering the courtroom. My mother's theatrical tears had dried up, replaced by genuine nervousness. My father had stopped his supportive nodding, his face now pale with dawning realization. They didn't know what was in that envelope, but they were beginning to suspect it wasn't good for their case. I smiled at them then, not a warm smile of familial recognition, but a cold, calculated expression that promised consequences. The judge's sharp intake of breath told me he'd reached the first page of the investigator's report. The rustling of papers filled the silent courtroom as he read, his expression growing darker with each page. My biological parents' lawyer leaned forward, trying to see what had captured the judge's attention so completely, while my own lawyer sat back with visible relief, finally understanding that I'd been planning something all along. What the judge was reading, what I was about to share with everyone in that courtroom, would not only destroy my biological parents' lawsuit, but would ensure they regretted ever finding my address. The Delgados had taught me patience, thoroughness, and the importance of having all the facts before making any decisions. They'd also taught me that people who abandon children in parks deserve exactly zero sympathy, and I was about to demonstrate just how well I'd learned that lesson. The judge looked up from the papers, his gaze moving between me and my biological parents with something that looked like disgust. He opened his mouth to speak, and I knew the real show was about to begin. The judge set the investigator's report down with deliberate care, his hands trembling slightly with what I recognized as suppressed anger. He removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and replaced them before speaking. Miss Ashford, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, would you please explain to the court the nature of these documents? I nodded, turning to face the courtroom gallery where several reporters had positioned themselves, notebooks ready. The Delgado restaurant chain was well known locally, and apparently my case had attracted media attention. Perfect. Your Honor, when my adoptive parents, Carlos and Rosa Delgado, began proceedings to adopt me in 1996, they hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to locate my biological parents and understand the circumstances of my abandonment. I spoke clearly, ensuring every word carried to the back of the room. Mr. Webb was extremely thorough in his investigation. He discovered that my biological parents, Robert and Linda Hartley, had 3 children in 1995. My older sister Jessica was 9, I was 7. And my baby brother Michael had just been born. What Mr. Webb found through financial records and interviews with former neighbors was that my parents had calculated that raising 3 children would cost approximately $18,000 more per year than raising 2. My biological mother made a small sound of protest, but her lawyer quickly silenced her with a hand on her arm. I continued without pause. The investigator interviewed the Hartley's landlord from that time, a Mrs. Eleanor Brennan, who is still alive and has provided a sworn affidavit included in these documents. Mrs. Brennan recalled multiple arguments she overheard through thin apartment walls, where my parents specifically discussed which child would be easiest to eliminate from their household expenses. They chose me because I was old enough to be self-sufficient, but young enough that my older sister Jessica could take over most of my care responsibilities. I paused, letting that sink in. They didn't abandon me in a moment of desperation or mental crisis. They planned it methodically over several months. The judge's jaw tightened as he flipped through more pages. My biological father had gone completely white, while my mother gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard her knuckles had turned pale. Their lawyer was frantically whispering to them, probably advising them to request a recess, but it was far too late for that. The damage was already spreading through the courtroom like wildfire. I retrieved another document from my briefcase, this one more recent. Your Honor, I'd also like to submit phone records from the past 6 months. You'll notice that my biological parents made over 40 calls to various law firms before finding one willing to take their case. In several recorded consultations, which I obtained legally through public record requests, they specifically discussed the value of the Delgado estate and calculated what percentage they could reasonably demand. On one recording, my biological father states, and I quote, "The kid owes us for the genetic material at least, and if she's sitting on millions, we deserve our cut." The reporters in the gallery were writing furiously now, and I saw several people in the public seating area shaking their heads in disgust. My biological parents' carefully constructed narrative of grieving, separated parents was disintegrating in real time. But I wasn't finished, not even close. The investigator's report also contains interviews with my older sister Jessica, who was located in 2003. She confirmed that after I was removed from the household, our parents told her I had gone to live with rich relatives who could provide better for me. She was instructed never to mention me to anyone outside the family. Jessica also stated that the money saved by my absence was not used for necessities, but rather for a new truck my father wanted, and a vacation to Florida the family took 6 months after abandoning me. This is slander! My biological mother suddenly shrieked, jumping to her feet. You can't prove any of this! That investigator made it all up. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Mrs. Hartley, sit down and be quiet, or I will have you removed from my courtroom. His voice carried an authority that made her collapse back into her chair immediately. He turned to me with something approaching approval in his eyes. Miss Ashford, do you have documentation to support these claims beyond the investigator's report? I smiled. Yes, Your Honor. I have Mrs. Brennan's sworn affidavit, phone records, bank statements from 1995 showing the truck purchase and vacation expenses, and a video deposition from my sister Jessica, who finally agreed to speak publicly about what happened after I contacted her 3 months ago. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. My biological parents' lawyer was now actively trying to sink into his chair, clearly realizing he'd been fed a completely false narrative by his clients. The judge raised his hand for silence, and the room immediately complied. I'll need to review all of this evidence in detail, he said. But based on what I've seen so far, I'm inclined to dismiss this case with prejudice. My biological father finally found his voice, standing up despite his lawyer's attempts to restrain him. She's lying. We loved her. We searched for her for years. His desperation was palpable, but his timing was catastrophically poor. Actually, I said, pulling out yet another document, I have proof you never searched for me at all. When the state conducted its investigation after I was found in the park, they sent notification letters to your last known address, ran newspaper ads, and even featured my case on local television news. The Delgados saved all the newspaper clippings. I held up a faded article from 1995 with my school photo prominently displayed under the headline, "Abandoned Girl Seeks Family." This ran for 6 consecutive weeks in the paper you subscribed to. Your cable bill from that period shows you had the exact news channel that featured my story. You saw these. You knew where I was. You chose not to come forward because you'd already decided I was too expensive to keep. The silence that followed was absolute and damning. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her keyboard in shock. My biological mother's face had gone from white to red, tears now flowing genuinely as she realized the full scope of their exposure. Their lawyer had his head in his hands, probably calculating how badly this would damage his reputation. I felt no satisfaction from their distress, only cold determination to finish what I'd started. The judge was reading through Jessica's video deposition transcript now, his expression growing increasingly severe. I knew what he was reading. My sister had described in detail how our parents had celebrated my absence, how they'd told her I was better off without them, how they'd never once expressed regret or concern about whether I was safe or happy. She'd also revealed something I hadn't known until she told me. They'd made a similar threat about abandoning her when she'd gotten pregnant at 17, telling her she could either get an abortion or find somewhere else to live. She'd chosen the abortion and had carried that trauma for years. Your Honor, I said, drawing his attention back to me. My biological parents aren't here because they've suffered emotional trauma from losing me. They're here because they spent 22 years not caring whether I was alive or dead, and then they discovered I'd inherited money. The timing of this lawsuit, filed exactly 3 weeks after a local business magazine published an article about the Delgado restaurant empire's valuation, is not coincidental. They saw an opportunity for profit and decided to cash in on the child they literally threw away. I walked back to my table and retrieved one final piece of paper. This is a letter my adoptive mother, Rosa, wrote to me shortly before she died. She never sent it, but I found it among her personal effects. In it, she describes how she and Carlos always feared this day might come, when my biological parents would see value in me that they'd never seen before. She wrote, "If they ever come for you, mija, remember that love is measured in actions, not words or blood. We chose you every single day. They chose themselves. My voice cracked slightly on those last words. The first genuine emotion I'd shown since entering the courtroom. The judge noticed, his severe expression softening momentarily with sympathy. Then his gaze hardened again as he looked at my biological parents. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, I've presided over family court for 23 years, and I have never been more appalled by what I've witnessed today. The evidence presented by the defendant makes it abundantly clear that you abandoned your daughter through calculated, premeditated decision-making, that you made no effort to reclaim her when you had ample opportunity, and that you filed this lawsuit purely for financial gain. He paused, letting his words settle like stones. This court finds no merit whatsoever in your claim of parental rights or emotional suffering. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into possible fraud and perjury charges, based on the false statements made in your initial filing. My biological father lunged toward me suddenly, his face contorted with rage, but 2 bailiffs intercepted him before he'd taken 3 steps. "You ungrateful little bitch!" he screamed as they restrained him. "We gave you life! You owe us!" The judge's gavel came down repeatedly, but my father kept shouting, "That money should be ours. We could have kept you. We chose to give you a better life." His words were so absurdly divorced from reality that several people in the gallery laughed out loud. The bailiffs were dragging him toward the courtroom exit now, his lawyer frantically trying to distance himself from the outburst. My biological mother sat frozen in her chair, mascara running down her face in black streams as she realized the full magnitude of their defeat. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, one that would ensure they never bothered me again. "Your Honor," I called out, halting the proceedings before the judge could officially dismiss the case. "I have one additional matter to bring before the court." He nodded, gesturing for me to continue. I pulled out a folder I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "I'd like to countersue my biological parents for emotional damages, specifically for the lifelong psychological trauma caused by their abandonment. I'm also requesting full reimbursement of all legal fees associated with defending against their frivolous lawsuit, plus punitive damages for malicious prosecution." The courtroom erupted again. My biological mother let out a wail of pure anguish, while my father, still being restrained by bailiffs, renewed his struggling with such violence that a 3rd officer had to assist. Their lawyer looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. The judge, however, looked at me with something approaching admiration. "Miss Ashford, you're well within your rights to file such a countersuit. Do you have a specific amount in mind?" I did. I'd calculated it very carefully. $2,100,000, Your Honor. The exact amount they tried to take from me. The symmetry was perfect, the irony delicious. They'd walked into this courtroom expecting to leave with half my inheritance, and instead they would leave owing me exactly that amount. The judge's small smile suggested he appreciated the poetic justice. "Very well. I'll approve the filing of your countersuit. We'll schedule a hearing for next month to determine the actual damages, though based on the evidence I've seen today, I'm inclined to rule in your favor." He turned to my biological parents' lawyer. "I suggest you advise your clients to settle immediately, because if this goes to trial, the publicity alone will destroy whatever reputation they have left." As the bailiffs finally succeeded in removing my still screaming father from the courtroom, my biological mother stood on shaking legs. She looked at me directly for the first time, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been regret or might have just been fear of financial ruin. "Isabella," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, we made mistakes. We were young and scared and stupid, but we're still your parents. Doesn't that mean anything?" I gathered my documents carefully, taking my time before responding. When I finally looked at her, I made sure she saw nothing but ice in my eyes. "You stopped being my parents the moment you drove away from that park," I said clearly. "Carlos and Rosa Delgado were my parents. They're the ones who earned that title through 22 years of love and sacrifice. You're just 2 strangers who share some DNA with me and who are about to discover exactly how expensive it is to throw away a child and then try to profit from her later." The judge dismissed the court, and I watched as my biological mother was led out by her lawyer, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The reporters immediately swarmed me with questions, but my lawyer intercepted them smoothly, promising a press conference later that afternoon. As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in months. The Delgados had taught me many things, but perhaps the most important was that family wasn't about biology. It was about who showed up, who stayed, who loved you unconditionally. And they'd also taught me that sometimes the best revenge was simply letting people face the natural consequences of their own terrible decisions. My biological parents had thrown me away like garbage, and now they were discovering that garbage has a way of piling up until you're forced to deal with it. I pulled out my phone and called my sister Jessica. We'd reconnected after I'd hired my own investigator to find her, and we'd been slowly building a relationship based on honest understanding of what we'd both survived. "It's done," I told her when she answered. "The case is dismissed, and I'm countersuing for the full amount they tried to take. Her laugh was bitter but satisfied. Good. They deserve everything that's coming to them. Are you okay? I considered the question carefully. Was I okay? I thought of Carlos teaching me to properly season carne asada, of Rosa braiding my hair before school, of 22 years of Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations and unconditional acceptance. Yeah, I said finally. I really am. The press conference that afternoon was standing room only. My lawyer had reserved a conference room at his firm, but we'd underestimated the media interest. Apparently, the story of abandoned child-turned-restaurateur defending herself against opportunistic biological parents had captured public imagination. Camera crews from 4 local news stations crowded the back wall, while print reporters filled every available seat. I stood at a podium with my lawyer beside me, the stack of evidence documents prominently displayed on the table behind us. I'd changed from my court outfit into one of Rosa's vintage dresses that I'd had altered to fit me, a subtle tribute to the woman who'd truly been my mother. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice steady, despite the nerves fluttering in my stomach. This morning, Judge Morrison dismissed the lawsuit filed against me by Robert and Linda Hartley, my biological parents, who abandoned me in a public park when I was 7 years old, because they decided 3 children were too expensive to raise. I paused, letting the cameras capture my calm demeanor. The Hartleys claimed they never legally relinquished parental rights, and deserved compensation for their emotional suffering. What they didn't know was that my adoptive parents, Carlos and Rosa Delgado, had hired an investigator in 1996, who thoroughly documented the Hartleys' deliberate decision to abandon me as a cost-cutting measure. A reporter in the front row raised his hand immediately. Miss Ashford, can you describe what was in that investigator's report? I'd prepared for this question. The report contained interviews with former neighbors, landlords, and financial records showing that my biological parents planned my abandonment over several months. They specifically chose me because I was old enough to be relatively independent, but young enough that my older sister could take over my care responsibilities, making me the most expendable family member from a budgeting perspective. The room erupted with follow-up questions, but I raised my hand for silence. The report also proved that the Hartleys never searched for me despite extensive media coverage of my case. They received notifications from the state, saw newspaper articles with my photo, and had access to televised news stories about the abandoned girl seeking her family. They chose not to respond because they'd already decided I wasn't worth the expense. Another reporter stood. What about your countersuit? You're seeking $2,100,000? I nodded. The exact amount they tried to take from me. I believe in proportional consequences. They walked into that courtroom expecting to profit from abandoning me. Instead, they'll pay for that decision in a way that ensures they never forget the cost of throwing away a child. My lawyer interjected smoothly. The evidence supporting Miss Ashford's countersuit is extensive and includes documented psychological trauma, ongoing therapy costs, and emotional damages spanning 22 years. We're confident the court will rule in her favor. As the press conference continued, I fielded questions about the Delgado restaurants, my adoptive parents' legacy, and my plans for the future. I spoke about Carlos and Rosa with genuine warmth, describing how they'd saved me not just from physical abandonment, but from the psychological damage of believing I was unwanted. The Delgados taught me that family is built through consistent love and daily choices, not biological connection, I explained to one particularly sympathetic reporter. They chose me every single day for 22 years. That's what makes them my real parents, not the people who contributed DNA and then drove away. After the official press conference ended, several reporters approached me privately with offers for exclusive interviews. The story had apparently struck a nerve with viewers, and my biological parents were quickly becoming symbols of everything wrong with parental negligence. One producer from a national morning show wanted me to appear alongside child advocacy experts to discuss abandonment trauma. I declined politely, explaining that my goal wasn't fame, but justice. The public response to the courtroom revelations came swiftly and brutally. By that evening, my biological parents' names were trending on social media, accompanied by their photos from court and scathing commentary. Someone had dug up their current address and place of employment. My biological father worked in shipping at a warehouse, while my mother was a part-time cashier at a grocery store. Both employers issued statements within hours, announcing that the Hartleys had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The court of public opinion was delivering its own verdict, and it wasn't merciful. I watched the news coverage from my apartment that night, a spacious 2-bedroom place I'd purchased with my first restaurant management bonus. The local news stations ran segments titled The Abandoned Heir and Parents or Predators, showing courthouse footage of my calm testimony contrasted with my biological father's violent outburst. Legal experts weighed in, universally condemning the Hartleys' lawsuit as frivolous and potentially criminal. Child psychologists discussed the long-term impacts of parental abandonment. Financial analysts calculated that my countersuit had an excellent chance of success. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, distant relatives, and business associates expressing support. The Delgado restaurant employees had created a group chat to share their reactions, many of them posting photos of Carlos and Rosa with captions about real family values. Several longtime customers sent flowers and cards to the flagship location, turning it into an impromptu shrine to my adoptive parents' memory. The outpouring of affection for the Delgados contrasted sharply with the vitriol being directed at the Hartleys, but the most important call came from Jessica. "Isabella," she said when I answered, her voice thick with emotion, "I just watched your press conference. You were amazing. Mom and Dad would have been so proud." We'd started calling them Mom and Dad in our conversations, a shared acknowledgement that the Hartleys didn't deserve those titles. I was terrified the whole time, I admitted, but I kept thinking about what Rosa would do. She never backed down from bullies, and she always said the truth was its own best weapon. Jessica was quiet for a moment. "They called me," she finally said. "Mom and Dad Hartley, I mean." Linda was crying, begging me to make a statement supporting them, saying I owed them loyalty as their daughter. My grip tightened on the phone. "What did you tell them?" Her laugh was harsh. "I told them I already gave my statement to your lawyer, and if they ever contacted me again, I'd file harassment charges." Then I hung up. Robert called back 3 times before I blocked them both. Pride surged through me. Jessica had spent years struggling with misplaced guilt about our biological parents, but she was finally breaking free. "How do you feel about that?" I asked gently. "Liberated," she said simply. "For the first time since I was 17, I don't feel like I owe them anything. Watching you stand up to them in court, using their own actions as weapons against them, it showed me that we have every right to demand better from the people who claim to love us." We talked for another hour, planning a visit where she could finally meet the restaurant staff who'd become my extended family. Jessica lived 3 states away with her husband and 2 kids. Children that the Hartleys had never bothered to meet despite being invited. It was yet another example of their selective interest in family relationships. They only cared when there was something in it for them. The next morning brought another development. My lawyer called with news that the Hartleys' attorney had officially withdrawn from their case, citing irreconcilable differences with his clients. Translation: my lawyer explained with barely suppressed amusement. He realized they'd lied to him about everything, and he doesn't want to be associated with them when the perjury charges hit. He's also probably worried about his own reputation after representing such obviously terrible people. This was excellent news for my countersuit. Without legal representation, the Hartleys would be at a severe disadvantage when we went before the judge next month. I spent the following weeks focused on the restaurants, throwing myself into the work that had always brought me comfort. The Delgado chain had been doing well, but I'd been developing plans for expansion that Carlos and Rosa had approved before their accident. Now seemed like the perfect time to honor their legacy by implementing those plans. I scheduled meetings with contractors, interviewed potential chefs, and scouted locations for an 8th restaurant. The work was exhausting but satisfying, a reminder that I'd built something real and valuable through actual effort, not through manipulative lawsuits. The Hartleys, meanwhile, were discovering just how expensive their greed had become. Their story had gone viral, picked up by national news outlets, and shared millions of times across social platforms. Someone had created a hashtag called genetic material, referencing my biological father's recorded comment about me owing them for DNA. It trended for 3 days, spawning memes and think pieces about parental entitlement. The warehouse where my biological father worked announced his termination after receiving hundreds of complaints from customers threatening boycotts if they continued employing him. My biological mother lost her cashier position when shoppers began deliberately avoiding her register and filming confrontations where they'd ask pointed questions about abandoning children. Their landlord, responding to media pressure and worried about property values, issued an eviction notice citing the negative attention their presence was bringing to the building. Within 2 weeks of the dismissed lawsuit, the Hartleys had lost their jobs, their housing, and any shred of public sympathy. I watched this cascade of consequences with detached interest. Some people on social media accused me of orchestrating a witch hunt, of using my resources to destroy 2 working-class people who'd made a mistake decades ago. But the vast majority recognized the Hartleys' current situation as entirely self-inflicted. They'd chosen to abandon me. They'd chosen to ignore opportunities to reclaim me. They'd chosen to file a frivolous lawsuit seeking millions. Every consequence they faced stemmed directly from those choices. 3 weeks after the court dismissal, my lawyer received a settlement offer from a new attorney the Hartleys had scraped together money to hire. They proposed dropping any future claims to parental rights or inheritance in exchange for me dropping the countersuit. The offer included a written apology and agreement to never contact me or my sister again. My lawyer presented this to me in his office, watching my face carefully for reactions. "It's actually a reasonable offer," he said. "You'd avoid the hassle of a trial, and they'd be permanently out of your life. The written apology could be made public, giving you additional vindication." I read through the proposed settlement carefully. noting the carefully worded apology that somehow managed to avoid actually taking responsibility for abandoning me. It referred to difficult circumstances and regrettable decisions without acknowledging the calculated cruelty of planning my abandonment over months. The financial terms would leave the Hartleys essentially judgment-free, able to rebuild their lives without the massive debt my countersuit would impose. What would you recommend? I asked my lawyer. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same thoughtful expression Carlos used to wear when teaching me about difficult business decisions. Professionally, I'd say it's a decent settlement. You get everything you really need. They stay away forever, you get public vindication, and you avoid months of legal proceedings. He paused meaningfully. Personally, as someone who's read every detail of what they did to you, I'd say they deserve to face the full consequences of their actions in court. But that's not a legal opinion, that's a human one. I set the settlement papers down and smiled. Then I'll respond as a human, not just as a defendant. Tell their lawyer we reject the settlement. We'll see them in court next month, and I'll be seeking the full $2,100,000 in damages plus legal fees and court costs. My lawyer's answering grin was fierce with approval. I was hoping you'd say that. The rejection of the settlement offer triggered another media cycle. Legal commentators debated whether I was being vindictive or appropriately firm. Child advocacy groups publicly supported my decision, stating that child abandonment should carry severe consequences. The Hartleys' new lawyer released a statement painting his clients as remorseful parents being victimized by their wealthy daughter's need for revenge. The statement backfired spectacularly when a journalist discovered that the Hartleys' apology in the settlement offer had been written by their lawyer, not them personally. When reporters tracked down Linda Hartley and asked her directly about the apology, she'd snapped that she had nothing to apologize for, and that I was an ungrateful opportunist. That soundbite played on loop across every news station, demolishing any remaining public sympathy for my biological parents. Robert Hartley didn't help their cause by creating social media accounts to defend himself. His posts, filled with profanity and accusations that I'd orchestrated their downfall, became instant screenshots shared widely as examples of exactly why I'd been right to refuse reconciliation. As the countersuit hearing date approached, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The Delgados had taught me that justice sometimes required patience and careful documentation. They'd saved that investigator's report for over 20 years, anticipating that someday I might need it. Rosa's letter, expressing her fears about exactly this scenario, showed remarkable foresight. They'd protected me even after death, and I was honoring their memory by refusing to let the Hartleys profit from their cruelty. The night before the hearing, I visited the graves of Carlos and Rosa Delgado. Their adjoining headstones were simple but elegant, inscribed with their names, dates, and the phrase, "Beloved parents of Isabella." I'd chosen that inscription deliberately, making it clear to anyone who visited that I claimed them as my family by choice. I knelt between their graves, placing fresh flowers on each. "I hope I'm making you proud," I whispered to the cold marble. "You taught me to stand up for what's right, to value family based on love, not biology, and to never let bullies win. Tomorrow, I'm going to show the world exactly how well I learned those lessons." The cemetery was empty except for me and the sounds of evening crickets. I stayed there for an hour, talking to Carlos and Rosa about the restaurants, about Jessica, about all the ways their love continued to shape my life years after they'd gone. When I finally stood to leave, I felt their presence like a warm hand on my shoulder, steady and reassuring. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, I knew they would have approved of my choices. The Hartleys had thrown me away assuming I was worthless. The Delgados had found me and recognized value that had nothing to do with money. And now the Hartleys were discovering that the child they'd discarded had grown into someone who wouldn't accept being treated as disposable. The drive home took me past the flagship Delgado restaurant, where the evening dinner service was in full swing. Through the large windows, I could see families laughing over meals, servers moving efficiently between tables, and the warm glow of Edison bulbs creating the cozy atmosphere Rosa had always insisted on. This was the legacy worth protecting. Not money, but the love and care that had built something beautiful from nothing. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Kicking ass tomorrow. Proud to be your sister." I smiled and typed back, "Couldn't do it without knowing you've got my back." She sent back a simple heart emoji, and I felt that surge of gratitude for the family I'd chosen, and who'd chosen me in return. The Hartleys had tried to force their way back into my life through legal manipulation and emotional blackmail. Tomorrow, I would show them exactly why that had been a catastrophic mistake. The evidence was overwhelming, the public support was massive, and most importantly, I had the moral high ground that came from being absolutely, unquestionably in the right. They'd abandoned me to save $18,000 a year, Tomorrow, they would learn that decision had cost them everything. The courtroom was even more packed for the countersuit hearing than it had been for the original case dismissal. Word had spread about my rejection of the settlement offer, and apparently the public's appetite for this story remained insatiable. I arrived 30 minutes early, wearing a navy suit that Rosa had bought me for my college graduation. My lawyer met me at the entrance with a thick briefcase full of additional evidence we'd compiled. Their lawyer tried to file for a continuance yesterday. He informed me as we walked through security. Claimed his clients needed more time to prepare their defense. The judge denied it. Good. The Hartleys had already been given more consideration than they deserved. Inside the courtroom, I saw my biological parents sitting at the defendant's table with their new lawyer, a harried-looking man in his 50s, who kept shuffling papers nervously. Linda Hartley had aged visibly in the 3 weeks since I'd last seen her. Her hair was unwashed, pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore a cheap dress that hung awkwardly on her frame. Robert Hartley looked even worse. He'd lost weight, his suit jacket sagging on his shoulders, and he refused to make eye contact with anyone. Their downfall had been swift and thorough, and it showed. The gallery behind them was notably empty compared to my side, where Jessica sat in the front row alongside several Delgado restaurant managers and employees who'd requested time off to support me. The contrast in support systems couldn't have been more stark. Judge Morrison entered, and we all rose. He settled into his chair with an expression of barely concealed distaste as he looked at the Hartleys. "Let's proceed," he said without preamble. "This is a hearing to determine damages in the countersuit filed by Isabella Ashford against Robert and Linda Hartley for emotional trauma resulting from childhood abandonment and malicious prosecution. Miss Ashford, your opening statement." I stood, walking to the center of the courtroom with the confidence that came from having truth on my side. "Your Honor, 22 years ago, Robert and Linda Hartley made a calculated decision to abandon me in a public park because they determined that raising 3 children was $18,000 more expensive per year than raising 2. That decision didn't just leave me waiting by a tree until dark, scared and hungry and confused. It fundamentally altered my understanding of trust, family, and self-worth." I paused, letting my words settle. Fortunately, I was found by park rangers and eventually adopted by Carlos and Rosa Delgado, who spent the next 2 decades proving that family is built through consistent love and daily choice. They gave me everything: stability, education, unconditional acceptance, and most importantly, they taught me that I had inherent value regardless of my biological origins or my cost to maintain. My voice strengthened. The Hartleys recently attempted to exploit the grief of my adoptive parents' deaths by filing a fraudulent lawsuit claiming parental rights and emotional suffering. They sought $2,100,000, exactly half of the inheritance I received from the people who actually raised me. Their lawsuit was dismissed because overwhelming evidence proved they never searched for me, never regretted abandoning me, and only became interested in me when they discovered I had money. I turned to look directly at Robert and Linda Hartley. My countersuit seeks the same amount they tried to take from me, not out of vengeance, but because actions must have proportional consequences. If abandoning a child costs nothing, if attempting to profit from that abandonment costs nothing, then we're sending a message that children are disposable when convenient and valuable only when profitable. I walked back to my table and retrieved a bound document. I'm seeking $2,100,000 to compensate for documented psychological trauma, ongoing therapy costs, loss of opportunity to form healthy family attachments in childhood, and the emotional distress caused by their recent lawsuit. Additionally, I'm requesting full reimbursement of legal fees and court costs, which currently total $97,400. The specific figures made the request concrete and undeniable. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Ashford. Mr. Brennan, your response on behalf of the defendants?" The Hartley's lawyer stood reluctantly. "Your Honor, my clients acknowledged that they made a terrible mistake 22 years ago. They were young, financially stressed, and made a decision they've regretted every day since. I nearly laughed at the blatant lie. The evidence showed they'd celebrated my absence and never attempted to find me. However," Brennan continued, "seeking over $2 million in damages from 2 people who currently have no employment, no assets, and no ability to pay such a judgment seems excessive and punitive rather than compensatory." He gestured toward his clients. "Robert and Linda Hartley have suffered significant consequences already. They've lost their jobs due to media coverage of this case. They've been evicted from their home. They've become pariahs in their community. My clients believe they've already paid a heavy price for their past mistakes, and they humbly request that the court consider their current financial situation when determining any damages award." His strategy was clear: paint the Hartleys as sufficiently punished and make me look like a bully kicking people while they were down. It might have worked if not for the extensive documentation I'd prepared. "Your Honor, I said, standing again without waiting for permission. May I respond to counsel's characterization of events? The judge gestured for me to proceed. Mr. Brennan states that his clients have regretted abandoning me every day for 22 years. I'd like to submit evidence that directly contradicts this claim. My lawyer handed me a folder, and I pulled out documents I'd obtained through Jessica's cooperation. These are birthday cards sent by my older sister Jessica to our biological parents over the years, in multiple cards from when Jessica's children were born. And as they grew older, she explicitly asks why her parents never want to meet their grandchildren, why they never ask about me, and whether they ever regret what they did to me. I read aloud from one card dated 6 years ago. Mom and Dad, Jamie starts kindergarten next month. He keeps asking why he doesn't have a Grandma Linda and Grandpa Robert like his friends do. What should I tell him? Do you ever think about Isabella and wonder if she's okay? I tried to find her again, but couldn't. Love, Jessica. The courtroom was utterly silent as I continued. The response from Linda Hartley, handwritten on the back of a grocery store receipt, says, and I quote, "Tell Jamie we're too busy to be grandparents. As for your sister, she's probably better off wherever she ended up. We did what we had to do and don't need to justify it to anyone. Stop asking about it." End quote. I looked at Linda Hartley, whose face had gone ashen. This doesn't sound like someone who regrets their decision every day. This sounds like someone who actively avoided confronting what they'd done. I presented several more similar examples, each one demolishing the narrative of remorseful parents haunted by their choices. Judge Morrison's expression grew progressively darker as he read through the evidence. Robert Hartley had slumped in his chair while Linda was crying again, but this time the tears looked like defeat rather than manipulation. Furthermore, I continued, regarding their current financial difficulties, I'd like to point out that the defendants lost their employment not because of media coverage, but because of their own actions following that coverage. Linda Hartley was terminated after she was filmed verbally abusing customers who questioned her about abandoning me. Robert Hartley was fired after he created social media accounts where he posted profanity-laden attacks against me and threats toward journalists covering our case. I submitted printouts of Robert's social media posts, highlighting particularly egregious examples where he'd called me a spoiled bitch and suggested I deserved to rot in hell for destroying his family. The judge read these with visible anger. These posts were made 2 weeks ago, I noted, long after their lawsuit was dismissed. They demonstrate ongoing malice and a complete lack of the remorse Mr. Brennan claims they feel. Their lawyer had no effective response. He sat down heavily, whispering urgently to his clients, who both looked like they wanted to disappear. The judge called a brief recess, and I stepped into the hallway where Jessica immediately hugged me tightly. "You're destroying them," she whispered. "Good, they deserve it." When we reconvened, Judge Morrison had clearly made his decision. His voice was firm and cold. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented, and I find Miss Ashford's claims entirely credible and well-documented. The defendants abandoned their 7-year-old daughter through calculated planning, showed no remorse or attempt to locate her over 22 years, and then filed a fraudulent lawsuit seeking to profit from that abandonment." He turned his severe gaze on the Hartleys. "Your own words, preserved in letters and social media posts, demonstrate that you feel no genuine regret for your actions. You're only sorry that your greed and cruelty have finally resulted in consequences you cannot avoid." The judge consulted his notes. "This court awards Isabella Ashford the full requested amount of $2,100,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, plus $97,400 in legal fees and court costs, for a total judgment of $2,197,400. Linda Hartley let out a strangled sob, while Robert simply stared at the table in front of him. Their lawyer made a weak attempt at requesting installment payments, but the judge cut him off. "The defendants have demonstrated no ability or willingness to pay any amount voluntarily. Miss Ashford's legal team may pursue collection through any lawful means, including wage garnishment and asset seizure." But I wasn't finished. I stood once more, drawing confused looks from both the judge and my own lawyer. "Your Honor, if I may, I have one additional request." He raised his eyebrows but nodded. "I'd like to request that the court issue a permanent restraining order preventing Robert and Linda Hartley from contacting me, my sister Jessica, or any member of Jessica's family, including her husband and children. Additionally, I request that they be legally prohibited from giving interviews about this case or me, and that any violation of these restrictions result in immediate contempt charges." The judge's slight smile suggested he approved of my thoroughness. "Granted, the court will issue a permanent restraining order with those exact specifications. Any attempt by the defendants to contact Miss Ashford or her family, or to profit from their story through interviews or book deals, will result in criminal contempt charges carrying potential jail time." Robert Hartley finally found his voice, standing up abruptly despite his lawyer's restraining hand. "This is insane. You're going to ruin us over something that happened 2 decades ago. We can't pay this. We have nothing." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "You have nothing because you spent your lives making selfish, cruel decisions that eventually caught up with you. This court has no sympathy for your situation." He looked at me with something approaching respect. Miss Ashford, your adoptive parents would be very proud of how you've handled this situation. You've demonstrated both strength and principle. As the bailiff approached to remove Robert, who was still protesting loudly, Linda Hartley turned to look at me one final time. Her face was streaked with tears and makeup, her expression a mixture of hatred and desperation. "I hope you're happy," she said, her voice shaking. "You've destroyed your own parents' lives." I met her gaze steadily, feeling no satisfaction but also no regret. "No," I corrected her quietly. "You destroyed your own lives when you abandoned a 7-year-old child in a park. I'm just making sure you remember that decision for the rest of your days." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as the Hartleys were escorted out, their lawyer trailing behind with his briefcase and his dignity both somewhat tattered. Jessica grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "It's really over," she breathed. "They can never hurt us again." But the day held one more surprise. As we gathered our belongings to leave, a woman in her 70s approached from the gallery. She had kind eyes and wore a simple cardigan over a floral dress. "Miss Ashford?" she asked hesitantly. "I'm Eleanor Brennan. I was the Hartleys' landlord in 1995. And I testified in the investigator's report about what I overheard through the apartment walls." I recognized the name immediately. "Mrs. Brennan, thank you so much for your statement. It was crucial to establishing the truth about what happened." She shook her head, fresh tears gathering in her eyes. "I've regretted not saying something back then for 22 years. I heard them planning to abandon you. Heard them calculating which child to get rid of, and I convinced myself it wasn't my business to interfere. I should have called child services before they left you in that park." Her voice broke. "I'm so sorry. I found myself hugging this stranger who'd carried guilt for over 2 decades. You couldn't have known they'd actually go through with it," I said gently. "And your testimony now helped make sure they faced consequences. That matters." She pulled back, studying my face with maternal concern. "You turned out well despite them. Your adoptive parents must have been wonderful people." "They were," I confirmed, feeling the familiar ache of loss. "They saved me in every way that counts." Mrs. Brennan nodded, satisfied. "Good, that's good. The world needs more people like the Delgados and fewer like the Hartleys." She patted my arm once more before walking away, and I watched her go with profound gratitude for the small acts of courage that had brought me justice. Outside the courthouse, the same reporters from the first trial were waiting, but this time I stopped to address them properly. Today, the court awarded me $2,197,400 in damages from the Hartleys, along with a permanent restraining order preventing them from ever contacting my family again. A reporter called out, "Do you think they'll actually be able to pay that amount?" I smiled coldly. "Whether they can pay it or not isn't really the point. The judgment will follow them forever. It will prevent them from obtaining credit, owning property, or building any financial security. Every job they get will result in wage garnishment. Any assets they manage to acquire will be subject to seizure. They'll spend the rest of their lives paying for the decision they made to abandon me, which seems appropriate since I spent my childhood paying for that same decision emotionally." Another reporter asked, "Do you feel like you've gotten closure now?" I considered the question carefully. Closure isn't really the right word. What I've gotten is justice and protection. The Hartleys can never hurt me or my sister again. They can't profit from their cruelty, and they'll carry the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives. That's not closure, that's accountability, and it's exactly what they deserve. As I walked away from the courthouse for the final time, surrounded by Jessica and my chosen family of Delgado employees and friends, I felt the weight of the past 3 months finally lift from my shoulders. The Hartleys had tried to take everything from me twice. Once when they left me in a park, and again when they filed their greedy lawsuit. Both times they'd failed, and this time, they'd paid a price that would haunt them until their last day. Carlos and Rosa had taught me that love was measured in actions, not words or biology. They'd shown me every day for 22 years that I was valuable, wanted, and worth the effort it took to raise a child properly. The Hartleys had shown me the opposite, and now they were learning that some lessons, once taught, can never be unlearned. The media frenzy following the judgment lasted for weeks. My story became a case study in law schools about parental abandonment and the limits of biological parental rights. Child advocacy organizations used the Hartley case as an example in their campaigns for stronger abandonment laws. I gave exactly 2 interviews, both to reporters who'd covered the story fairly, and then I stepped back from the spotlight completely. There was work to do, and I'd spent enough time on the Hartleys. The collection process for the $2 million judgment began immediately. My lawyer hired a forensic accountant to track down every asset the Hartleys might have, though we knew there wasn't much to find. They'd been living paycheck to paycheck before losing their jobs, and their financial situation had only deteriorated since. But financial recovery wasn't really the goal. The judgment itself was the punishment, a permanent stain on their credit reports and public records that would follow them forever. Within the first month, garnishment orders were placed on any future earnings either of them might have. This meant that if they ever found employment again, 25% of their wages would automatically go to paying my judgment. The forensic accountant discovered a small retirement account Robert had through his former employer, approximately $14,000. We seized it immediately. Their 2003 Toyota Camry was repossessed and sold at auction for $3,800. A small savings account Linda had opened years ago, and apparently forgotten about, yielded another $860. In total, we recovered $18,600 in the first 2 months, barely a fraction of what they owed, but symbolically perfect. That was almost exactly the amount they'd hoped to save per year by abandoning me. I instructed my lawyer to donate that initial recovery to a local children's charity that helped kids in foster care. The organization sent me a lovely letter thanking me for the contribution and describing how the money would fund art therapy programs for traumatized children. It felt like the right thing to do, transforming the Hartleys' cruelty into something that helped other abandoned kids heal. Meanwhile, the restraining order proved its worth almost immediately. 3 different tabloid magazines contacted the Hartleys offering money for exclusive interviews. Linda apparently tried to accept one offer, before her lawyer reminded her that doing so would result in contempt charges and possible jail time. Robert attempted to start a crowdfunding campaign to fight against my daughter's vindictive lawsuit, but it was shut down within hours after my legal team sent cease and desist letters. Every attempt they made to profit from their story or to paint themselves as victims was swiftly blocked by the court order. The permanent nature of that restraint gave me peace of mind that they could never use my name or story to rehabilitate their image. Jessica and I grew closer during this period, talking nearly every day as she processed her own complicated feelings about our biological parents' downfall. Sometimes I feel guilty, she admitted during one late-night phone call. Like I should feel bad that they've lost everything. But then I remember how they treated both of us, and the guilt disappears. You don't owe them guilt, I reminded her. They made their choices knowing the risks. Nobody forced them to abandon me or to file that lawsuit. These are natural consequences of their actions. She sighed. I know. It's just hard to reconcile the parents I remember from childhood with the people I've seen them become. Or maybe they were always this way, and I was too young to recognize it. We talked about her memories of our early family life, and I was struck by how many red flags she'd normalized. The constant fighting about money, the way our parents would joke about getting rid of one of us kids, the emotional volatility and manipulation. They abandoned you physically, Jessica observed, but they abandoned me emotionally years before that. I just didn't realize it until recently. The healing process was ongoing for both of us, but having each other made it bearable. The 8th Delgado restaurant opened 4 months after the trial, a sleek modern space in an up-and-coming neighborhood that still honored Carlos and Rosa's commitment to authentic family recipes and warm hospitality. I named it Casa de Rosa, putting my adoptive mother's name on the sign where it belonged. The opening night was packed with friends, employees, loyal customers, and local press. During my speech at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I spoke about legacy and chosen family. Carlos and Rosa Delgado taught me that family isn't about who gives you life. It's about who makes your life worth living. They took a scared, abandoned 7-year-old and showed her that she was valuable, worthy of love, and capable of building something beautiful. This restaurant honors their memory and their values: quality, authenticity, and treating every customer like family. The crowd applauded, and I saw several people wiping away tears. The Delgado employees had become fiercely protective of me during the trial, and they viewed Casa de Rosa as a collective tribute to the people who'd built this business with love and integrity. One of the longtime chefs, Miguel, approached me after the ceremony. "Miss Isabella," he said, his eyes wet with emotion. "Mr. Carlos and Mrs. Rosa, they would be so proud of you, not just the restaurant, but how you stood up to those people who tried to hurt you. You showed them what real strength looks like." I managed to thank him before my own tears started falling. The Delgados had created more than a business. They'd built a community of people who understood that family could be chosen, earned, and maintained through consistent love and respect. Meanwhile, the Hartleys' situation continued to deteriorate in ways that would have been almost comical if they weren't so deserved. Robert found temporary employment at a fast food restaurant, but quit after 2 weeks when his wages were garnished, and he realized he'd be working essentially to pay me. Linda attempted to work as a house cleaner but struggled to find clients once background checks revealed her identity. Their new apartment, a studio in a rough neighborhood, cost $800 a month, which they could barely afford even with assistance programs. They'd applied for bankruptcy protection, hoping to discharge my judgment, but my lawyer successfully argued that debts arising from willful and malicious conduct weren't dischargeable. The bankruptcy court agreed, meaning the $2 million judgment would follow them even through bankruptcy proceedings. Every financial door they tried to open slammed in their faces, branded with my name and their past actions. 6 months after the judgment, I received an unexpected letter. It had been sent through my lawyer's office to avoid violating the restraining order, and it was from Linda Hartley. My lawyer advised me not to read it, suggesting it was probably manipulation or harassment, but curiosity won out. The letter was handwritten on lined notebook paper, the writing shaky and uneven. "Isabella, It began. I know I'm not supposed to contact you, so I'm sending this through your lawyer, hoping he'll at least show it to you. I need you to understand something about that day in the park. We were drowning financially. Robert had lost his job. We were 3 months behind on rent, and the baby wouldn't stop crying. Every night felt like we were suffocating under the weight of bills and responsibilities. When we decided to leave you in the park, it wasn't because we didn't love you. It was because we thought you'd be better off in the foster system, where the state would pay for your care. We thought they'd place you with a nice family quickly because you were pretty and well-behaved. We thought we were doing the best thing for everyone. The letter continued in this vein for several paragraphs, attempting to reframe abandonment as sacrifice. When we saw you'd been adopted by wealthy people with restaurants, we felt vindicated. See, we'd told ourselves. She ended up somewhere better than we could have given her. It proved we'd made the right choice. We convinced ourselves that tracking you down would only disrupt your new life, so we stayed away. It wasn't until we were struggling again years later that Robert suggested maybe you'd want to help your biological parents now that you were successful. We thought you'd understand that family helps family, even if we'd been separated for a long time. The final paragraph was the most telling. I'm not asking you to forgive us or to drop the judgment, though obviously that would help. I just need you to know that we're not monsters. We're ordinary people who made a hard choice in a difficult situation, and we've paid for it more than seems fair. We've lost everything. Our jobs, our home, our dignity, our future. We'll probably never recover from this. I hope someday you'll realize that revenge isn't as satisfying as you thought it would be, and that destroying us hasn't healed whatever damage you think we caused. Signed, Linda Hartley. I read the letter 3 times, waiting to feel something. Guilt, pity, anger, anything. Instead, I felt only cold clarity. Linda still didn't understand what she'd done wrong. She viewed abandonment as a practical decision made under financial pressure, not as a fundamental moral failure. She thought apologizing for being ordinary people in a difficult situation somehow absolved her of deliberately leaving a child in a park. And most tellingly, she still believed I was the one who'd destroyed them, not acknowledging that they'd destroyed themselves through their own choices. I wrote a response, knowing my lawyer would ensure it didn't violate the restraining order by being sent through official channels. Mrs. Hartley, I wrote, your letter demonstrates exactly why the judgment was appropriate and necessary. You still don't understand what you did wrong. You abandoned a 7-year-old child not because you had no other options, but because you chose the option that was most convenient for you financially. You could have surrendered me to state custody properly. You could have worked with social services to find family placement. You could have done literally anything other than leaving a small child in a park with instructions to wait for you, knowing you'd never return. That wasn't a hard choice in a difficult situation. That was cruelty disguised as pragmatism. I continued. You claim you thought I'd end up somewhere better, but you never checked. You never called the state to confirm I was safe. You never looked at the news coverage begging for information about the abandoned girl. You made assumptions that justified your decision, and then spent 2 decades avoiding any information that might challenge those assumptions. That's not love or sacrifice. That's willful negligence. My pen moved faster as 22 years of suppressed anger finally found words. You say you're not monsters, just ordinary people. But ordinary people don't abandon their children. Ordinary people face financial hardship and find solutions that don't involve discarding a family member. Millions of parents every day deal with overwhelming stress, crying babies, and financial pressure without resorting to abandonment. You weren't victims of circumstances. You were people who chose the cruelest available option because it was easier than being decent parents. I paused, considering how to end the letter. You claim I've destroyed you through revenge, but examine what actually destroyed you. You lost your jobs because you verbally abused customers and posted threatening social media messages. You lost your home because you couldn't afford rent after losing income from your own actions. You face a massive judgment because you filed a fraudulent lawsuit seeking to profit from the child you abandoned. Every single consequence you're experiencing stems directly from your own decisions, not from my need for revenge. The final paragraph was important. You say we'll never recover from this judgment. Good, that's the point. You threw away a 7-year-old child because you didn't want to spend $18,000 a year on her care. Now you'll spend the rest of your lives paying for that decision. That's not revenge. That's justice. And yes, it is extremely satisfying. I signed it Isabella Delgado Ashford, deliberately including my adoptive parents' name to remind Linda who my real family was. My lawyer delivered the response through proper legal channels, and I never heard from Linda Hartley again. The restraining order had teeth, and apparently even she could learn when the consequences were immediate and severe. Life moved forward with surprising normality after that. The restaurants thrived, each location developing its own personality while maintaining the core values Carlos and Rosa had established. I hired a general manager to handle day-to-day operations, freeing me to focus on strategic growth and menu development. Jessica visited with her family for Casa de Rosa's first anniversary, and watching her kids play in the restaurant while servers brought them special treats, I felt profound gratitude for the family I'd built from the wreckage of my childhood. 1 year after the judgment, the forensic accountant's quarterly report showed we'd recovered $63,000 through various seizures and garnishments. It was still a tiny fraction of the total amount owed, but the slow, steady collection process served its purpose. Every paycheck the Hartleys earned was reduced. Every asset they tried to hide was discovered and seized. Every attempt to rebuild was hampered by my judgment hovering over their financial lives like a permanent shadow. I approved the accountant's recommendation to donate each recovered amount to children's charities, transforming the Hartleys' debt into support for kids who'd experienced abandonment or foster care. Over the next several years, my judgment against the Hartleys funded art therapy programs, educational scholarships, and emergency housing for displaced children. The Hartleys' cruelty was being systematically converted into help for other kids who'd suffered similar trauma. It felt like the most appropriate justice possible. The second anniversary of the trial brought an unexpected phone call. A documentary filmmaker wanted to create a film about parental abandonment, using my case as the central narrative. She'd already interviewed child psychologists, legal experts, and former foster children. She wanted my participation to tell the complete story. I declined, explaining that I'd moved forward with my life and had no interest in reliving the trial. But I did agree to let her use court transcripts and public records with one condition. Any proceeds from the documentary had to go to children's advocacy organizations. She agreed immediately, and the resulting film premiered at a film festival 18 months later to critical acclaim. It won awards for documentary filmmaking and sparked national conversations about strengthening child abandonment laws. I never watched it, but I received letters from people who had, thanking me for speaking up and giving them courage to confront their own family traumas. 3 years after the judgment, Jessica called with unexpected news. "Isabella, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how you're going to react." Her nervous tone immediately put me on alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly. It's just, well, Linda had a stroke. She's in the hospital, and the doctors say she probably won't fully recover." Robert called me, asking if we'd help with medical expenses. My first instinct was to laugh at the audacity, but Jessica's distress stopped me. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to contact a social worker about Medicaid and hung up." "But Isabella?" Part of me feels guilty. I know she's a terrible person who doesn't deserve help, but she's still our biological mother, and she's suffering. I understood Jessica's conflict. Despite everything, she'd lived with the Hartleys longer than I had, and remembered happier times from early childhood. "Jess, listen to me. Linda made choices that led directly to this situation. She lost her job and income because of her own actions. The reason she can't afford medical care is because she and Robert tried to steal from me and face consequences for that theft. You're not responsible for her well-being. You never were." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "I know you're right. I just needed to hear you say it." We talked for another hour about guilt, family obligations, and the difference between cruelty and boundary setting. By the end, Jessica felt secure in her decision to maintain no contact, and I felt grateful that she'd called me instead of making a decision based on misplaced obligation. Linda Hartley's stroke left her partially paralyzed and unable to work. Robert, now in his 60s with his own health problems, became her primary caregiver, while still trying to earn enough to cover their basic expenses. The garnishment of his wages continued automatically, taking 25% of whatever small amounts he managed to earn. According to the updates my lawyer received, they were living in a trailer park on the outskirts of town, surviving on government assistance and whatever odd jobs Robert could find. Their combined monthly income, after garnishment, was less than $1,500. The life they'd built through their own destructive choices had become exactly as limited and difficult as they'd feared mine would be if they'd kept me. 5 years after the judgment, on a sunny afternoon while I was reviewing menus for the 9th Delgado restaurant location, my lawyer called with news. "Isabella, I wanted to inform you before you hear it elsewhere. Robert Hartley died yesterday. Heart attack. He was found by a neighbor after not being seen for 2 days. Linda is being moved to a Medicaid nursing facility since she can't care for herself." I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no grief, just a neutral acknowledgement of information. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "Does this affect the judgment at all?" "His death discharges his portion of the debt, but Linda's portion remains. Of course, she has no assets or income to garnish now, so realistically we won't recover anything further. The judgment will remain on record, but collection is essentially impossible." We discussed the logistics briefly before hanging up. I sat at my desk for a long time afterward, thinking about Robert Hartley and the life he'd wasted through his own cruelty and greed. He'd died alone in a trailer, estranged from both his daughters, having destroyed every relationship and opportunity through his own decisions. He'd spent his final years under the shadow of a judgment that ensured he'd never escape the consequences of abandoning his daughter. Was that justice? I thought of Carlos and Rosa, who'd died together in an accident, surrounded by love and leaving behind a legacy of compassion and success. I thought of the hundreds of employees whose lives they'd improved, the thousands of customers who'd enjoyed meals in restaurants built on principles of family and quality. I thought of me, the abandoned child they'd transformed into someone capable of building on their foundation. Yes. Robert Hartley's lonely death in a trailer while owing an unpayable debt was justice. Not because it gave me satisfaction, but because it demonstrated the immutable law that cruelty compounds into isolation, while love compounds into legacy. Linda Hartley would spend her remaining years in a state-funded facility, her stroke having erased much of her memory, but leaving intact, according to reports, her awareness of who I was and what she'd done. The nursing home staff noted she often became agitated when watching television, perhaps triggered by mentions of the restaurant chain, or by memories she couldn't fully access but still felt the weight of. She would never make another choice to hurt me or Jessica. She would never profit from our stories. She would live out her days in the consequences of her decisions, which was exactly what she deserved. I never visited her. Jessica didn't either. We'd both moved forward with our lives, carrying the Delgados' lessons about chosen family and earned love. Robert and Linda Hartley had become footnotes in our personal histories, cautionary tales we occasionally referenced but no longer allowed to occupy space in our daily thoughts. 7 years after the trial, Casa de Rosa expanded to include a charitable foundation in Carlos and Rosa Delgado's name. The foundation's mission was to provide financial support, mentorship, and career training to young adults aging out of foster care, particularly those interested in culinary careers. We offered paid apprenticeships at all 10 Delgado restaurant locations, along with housing stipends and educational support. The program's first class included 8 young people, all of whom had experienced various forms of parental abandonment or neglect. Working with them, seeing their potential bloom under consistent support and high expectations, gave profound meaning to everything I'd survived. Jessica's oldest child, Jamie, was now 15 and had expressed interest in following his aunt into the restaurant business. He spent summer breaks working in the Casa de Rosa kitchen, learning from Miguel and the other chefs who'd known Carlos and Rosa. Watching him carefully prepare mole sauce using Rosa's original recipe, I saw the continuation of a legacy that transcended biology. The Delgados' values lived on not through genetic inheritance, but through taught wisdom and modeled behavior. The Hartley judgment remained on public record, a permanent mark against Linda's name that would outlive her. Occasionally, journalists would contact me for anniversary pieces about the case, and I'd politely decline interviews while directing them to court documents that told the story accurately. The case had apparently influenced several state legislatures to strengthen child abandonment laws and close loopholes that had allowed the Hartleys to avoid criminal prosecution back in 1995. If my experience prevented even one other child from being discarded like garbage, then the pain of reliving it through legal proceedings had been worthwhile. I maintained a sparse file on the Hartleys' current status, updated quarterly by the forensic accountant who still monitored Linda's financial situation. She remained in the nursing facility, her care covered by Medicaid. She had no visitors according to staff reports, no one who called or sent cards. She would die alone, surrounded by strangers, having successfully alienated every person who'd once loved her. Sometimes I wondered if she understood the direct line from abandoning me in a park to her isolated final years. Probably not. People like the Hartleys rarely connected their choices to their outcomes. On the 10th anniversary of the trial, I organized a celebration at the original Delgado restaurant location. All the employees, past and present, were invited, along with Jessica's family, program graduates from our foster care initiative, and the reporters who'd covered the story fairly. During my speech, I talked about justice, legacy, and the difference between biological connection and chosen family. 10 years ago, my biological parents tried to take everything Carlos and Rosa Delgado had built, claiming rights they'd abandoned decades earlier. The court disagreed, and the Hartleys faced consequences that have followed them every day since. But tonight isn't about them. It's about honoring the people who showed me what real family means through 22 years of consistent love and daily choice. I raised my glass to Carlos and Rosa, who proved that family is built through actions, not accidents of biology. To everyone here who's helped build and maintain their legacy, and to all the kids in foster care who are waiting for someone to choose them the way the Delgados chose me. May they find their own Carlos and Rosa, and may they someday pay that gift forward. The room erupted in applause, and several people openly wept. After the formal program ended, people shared their own stories of chosen family, of parental figures who weren't related by blood but who'd made all the difference. The evening became a celebration not just of the Delgados, but of the radical idea that family could be deliberately constructed rather than passively accepted. Later, as I helped clean up after the event, Jessica approached with something in her hand. "I found this in Mom Hartley's things after Dad Hartley died," she said, using the names we'd assigned to make clear they weren't our parents in any meaningful sense. The nursing home sent it with some other items when they cleared out their trailer. "I thought you should have it." She handed me a small photo, faded and creased. It showed 3 children, a 9-year-old girl, a 7-year-old girl, and a baby. Jessica, me, and Michael, taken a few months before they'd abandoned me. In the photo, Jessica had her arm around my shoulders protectively. I was smiling at the camera. The baby was crying. On the back, in faded pen, someone had written, "Our 3 kids, 1995. I stared at the photo for a long moment, studying the face of the 7-year-old girl who'd had no idea what was coming. She looked happy, trusting, normal, exactly like a child should look. "Do you want to keep it?" Jessica asked gently. I thought about it, then shook my head. No, that girl in the photo doesn't exist anymore. She became someone better, someone stronger. Someone who learned that family is built through love, not obligation. I handed the photo back to Jessica. You keep it if you want, or throw it away. Either option is fine with me. She studied my face for signs of suppressed emotion, but I felt genuinely at peace with my decision. The past was simply data points that had led to the present. I didn't need a faded photograph to remember where I'd come from, or how far I'd traveled. The following week brought a final update from the forensic accountant. Linda Hartley had died in her sleep at the nursing facility, 7 years almost to the day after Robert's death. She'd been 73 years old, her health having deteriorated steadily after the stroke. She died owing me $1,933,400, the remaining balance after various small collections over the years. The accountant asked if I wanted to pursue the debt against her estate, such as it was. I declined. The judgment had served its purpose. It had followed her every day, preventing her from ever escaping the consequences of her choices, reminding her with every seizure and garnishment that actions have prices. Whether she'd paid that price in full financially was irrelevant. She'd paid it in every way that mattered. I attended neither funeral. The Hartleys had been strangers who shared some DNA with me. Nothing more. Their deaths were simply the natural end of lives lived without love, integrity, or genuine human connection. They'd chosen cruelty and convenience over family, greed over grace, and they died alone, having destroyed every relationship they'd ever had. Meanwhile, I stood in restaurants bearing the Delgado name, surrounded by people who'd chosen me and whom I'd chosen in return. I mentored foster kids aging out of the system, giving them the opportunities Carlos and Rosa had given me. I built a legacy based on the values they'd modeled: consistency, quality, generosity, and the radical belief that family was something you created through daily choice rather than accepted through biological accident. The Hartley case occasionally came up in conversations with program participants who'd also experienced parental abandonment. I'd tell them honestly about the long legal fight, the judgment, the consequences that followed my biological parents for the rest of their lives. But I'd always end with the same message: justice matters and accountability matters. But what matters most is what you build after you survive. The Hartleys tried to take what the Delgados built. They failed. They spent their final years in consequences of their own making. I spent those same years expanding restaurants, creating opportunities, and proving that chosen family can be stronger than biological ties. Focus on what you're building, not on making your betrayers pay. The best revenge is actually living well while they inevitably destroy themselves through their own terrible choices. Some people found that advice helpful. Others wanted more explicit vengeance. I understood both responses. The Hartleys were gone now, their names appearing only in legal databases and news archives. Cautionary tales about parental abandonment and the long reach of consequences. I was here, building something lasting, surrounded by people I loved and who loved me in return. Every evening when I locked up whichever restaurant location I'd visited that day, I would pause before leaving and say quietly, "Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Rosa. I hope I'm making you proud." Some might call it silly, talking to people who'd been dead for over a decade, but I knew with absolute certainty that they were proud. They'd raised me to stand up for what was right, to value substance over surface, to understand that family was built through actions, not words. They'd taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to accept someone's attempt to rewrite history with lies and manipulation. The Hartleys had thrown away a 7-year-old girl because she cost too much to keep. That girl had grown into a woman who knew her own worth, who built something valuable through consistent effort, who transformed their cruelty into motivation to help other abandoned children find their way. They'd intended to save $18,000 a year by discarding me. Instead, their decision led to them owing over $2 million they could never pay, dying in poverty and isolation while I thrived in prosperity and love. The mathematics of karma had worked perfectly. On particularly difficult days, when restaurant operations frustrated me, or when I struggled with trust issues stemming from early abandonment, I would pull up the photos of Carlos and Rosa that I kept on my phone. There they were at my high school graduation, beaming with pride. At my college acceptance, popping champagne. At the opening of restaurant number 5, cutting a ceremonial ribbon. In every photo, their love was visible and uncomplicated. They'd never abandoned me, never betrayed my trust, never made me question whether I was worth keeping. They'd simply loved me, consistently and unconditionally, for 22 years. That was family. That was legacy. That was justice. The Hartleys had tried to steal it, and they'd paid with everything they had. As I prepared to open restaurant number 11, a location that would focus specifically on training program graduates and creating management opportunities for former foster youth. I thought about how far the Delgado legacy had expanded, from 3 small family restaurants to 11 locations employing over 400 people, from personal survival to systematic programs helping hundreds of abandoned kids find their path, from one scared 7-year-old abandoned in a park to a community of chosen families spanning the city. The grand opening invitation for the new location included a dedication. This restaurant is dedicated to Carlos and Rosa Delgado, who proved that the greatest families are built through choice, consistency, and love. And to all the children waiting in parks, literal or metaphorical, for someone to choose them. You are valuable, you are worthy, and somewhere, your Carlos and Rosa are coming. The night before the opening, I visited the Delgado's graves one final time to share the news. Restaurant 11 opens tomorrow, I told their headstones. It's the biggest one yet, and it's going to train foster kids to become chefs and managers. We've already placed 38 program graduates in careers across the restaurant industry. The foundation has helped over 200 kids with housing, education, and job training. I paused, running my fingers over Rosa's name carved in marble. The Hartleys are both gone now. They died owing me almost $2 million, having lost everything through their own greed and cruelty. Linda spent her final years in a nursing home with no visitors. Robert died alone in a trailer. They destroyed themselves trying to destroy me, and I didn't have to lift a finger beyond defending what was rightfully mine. The cemetery was quiet except for evening birds and distant traffic. I hope you can see all of this from wherever you are. I hope you know that every good thing I've built, every kid I've helped, every choice I've made to create family instead of accepting biology, all of it comes from what you taught me. You saved me. And now I'm paying that forward to every kid who needs someone to believe they're worth saving. As I drove away from the cemetery, the city lights spread out before me like stars, and I felt profound peace. The Hartleys were gone, reduced to cautionary tales and unpayable debts. The Delgados lived on through restaurants, through programs, through the hundreds of lives they'd touched by choosing love over convenience. I'd been thrown away like garbage at 7 years old. At 36, I owned a multi-million-dollar restaurant empire, ran a foundation helping abandoned children, and lived surrounded by chosen family who valued me exactly as I was. The Hartleys had tried to profit from my success, and instead had paid the ultimate price. They'd lost everything while I kept building. They'd died alone and unmourned while hundreds of people would celebrate the Delgado's memory at tomorrow's opening. Justice wasn't just about legal judgments and financial consequences, though those mattered. Justice was about truth winning, about consistency being rewarded, about cruelty resulting in isolation while love resulted in legacy. The Hartley's story ended in a nursing facility, in a trailer park, their names spoken only as warnings. Mine was still being written, surrounded by people who'd chosen me and whom I'd chosen in return, building something beautiful from the wreckage they'd tried to create. And that, I decided as I pulled into the parking lot of Casa de Rosa to do final preparations for tomorrow's grand opening of Location 11, was the most satisfying revenge possible. Not that I'd destroyed them, they'd done that themselves, but that I'd transformed their cruelty into something that helped other abandoned children find their way home. Carlos and Rosa would have approved, and in the end, their approval was the only thing that had ever mattered.